Hey there humans, Bob here, welcome to another Marvel Avengers video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my Prime Hulk build. Most builds out there focus on a single thing, but these Prime builds are made for you to be able to tackle pretty much anything that the game throws at you. This Prime Hulk is built to clear rooms and take out bosses with ease. On top of that, he's one of the easiest ones to build. Don't forget to like and subscribe as we roll that intro. So, before we get into it, let's go over the sections that we're going to cover in this video. Number 1, stats, just how I built my hero and why I focused on these stats. Number 2, skills, what skills I've selected and why. 3, champion points, what my focus around endgame leveling is. Number 4, gear, which perks I'm focusing on and why, and also where to farm this gear. And number 5, showcase, how this build works in combat. Right, let's start with which stats I focus on. My Hulk is unlike the majority of my builds as there is no way I'm going to run a ranged build with him. Maybe one day I'll build that out, but for now we'll focus on his strengths, melee and heroic. This build heavily focuses on heroic regen and I've perfected it to the point where I can do 3 thunderclaps in just under 10 seconds. So my choice stats for this build are firstly Valor. Valor not only governs heroic effectiveness, which helps my damage output when using Hulk's heroics, but it also dictates the amount of critical damage that you can output, which is key to this build. Secondly, as mentioned before, I run a melee Hulk, so might is a priority for me. Even if Hulk benefits more from Valor, it's still really important to stack heavily into this stat. Finally, I tend to make sure I have at least some resilience and resolve, and in this build I've leaned more on resilience as that is the defense stat that rolls on raid gear, which is like 50% of the gear in this build. Resilience, by the way, is the stat that governs armor percentage, which basically translates to how much less damage you take. Considering I'm not running all raid gear on this build, I'm happy with the 34% that I've managed to rack up here, as it will negate a third of any incoming damage. Let's move on to skills now. Obviously I have all of Hulk's base skills unlocked, but let's go into the specifics. Starting with the specialty tree. Under support heroic ability, I use Rampaging Bone Shaker. Since this build focuses on heroics and having Bone Shaker activated at all times, this makes the most sense as Hulk is fantastic at wiping out multiple enemies at once with his ultimate heroic. So, having the ability to extend Bone Shaker by 5 seconds for defeating 5 enemies is perfect for this build. Next, under support, I use Savage Heroism, which increases the chance that enemies that are taunted will drop heroic orbs. This furthers Hulk's ability to maintain an infinite cycle of heroics, as Bone Shaker itself will taunt enemies in your proximity upon activation of the heroic. So essentially this perk and the one before it feed into themselves, making Hulk an absolute powerhouse. Now onto the Assault heroic specializations, and again our focus is on heroics, so first up I use Heroic Destruction, which provides a 50% chance to generate a heroic orb. On top of this, the skill itself also counts as a takedown when used on larger enemies like Exos or Adaptoids, which if paired with upcoming Mastery skill can also guarantee another heroic orb. Secondly, I use the Barbaric Charge specialty to taunt nearby enemies and instantly overcharge my rage meter. This again feeds into both the heroic recharge in this build, but also into damage buffs too. Finally now, onto the ultimate specializations. For the first, I use Ground Zero. As well as drawing enemies in to help with crowd control, this specialty provides an AoE that damages enemies with Gamma, but also heals any teammates inside of it. This is very helpful for dealing battery damage, but also increases survivability in tight situations. And finally, as the last specialization, I use Thunderclap Heroic Recovery. For, well, you guessed it, more heroic orbs. So far, this means you have 3 separate ways of generating heroic orbs, and later on in the build, it'll become apparent why this is the key focus of most of the skill selections for Hulk. Now, let's look at the Mastery skill tree. First off, melee. In the first slot, I use Vice Grip. It's not really important to this build, but being a melee hero in Avengers is tough due to stagger from enemies. This helps stop that with a held enemy in your hands, even if it is a bit situational. Speaking of, to help with my ability to grab enemies, I next use Enhanced Grab. This will allow me a 15% better chance at picking up evasive enemies. A bit of a callback now, the third skill selection here is one I mentioned earlier. Heroic Takedown Mastery gives you a heroic orb when performing a takedown on an enemy. If the enemy is larger though, like an Exo, you can actually use Hulk's Assault Heroic to initiate a takedown without stunning the enemy first to generate an orb too. Onto the range section of masteries now, and being brutally honest, neither of these first 2 perks really matter at all to this build, and frankly, whoever is running a ranged Hulk as their day-to-day build is a masochist. But for the first skill, I've gone with Rubble, as at least the extra stun can help to knock back enemies Hulk can't reach out of the sky. And then next I use range damage to buff range damage by 15%. For the third skill, I've gone for hand cannon, which increases light and heavy attack damage by 1/3 when using small debris as a weapon. For those of you who know, there's a pretty powerful Hulk move where you pick up debris and then dodge before performing a light combo you can hit for a lot extra damage. This only helps to increase that extra damage further. Onto the intrinsic ability masteries now, and the first one I use is Raging Heroics. This helps boost my heroic regen when using rage. Very useful when I'm unable to create heroic orbs, like in boss fights. For the second mastery here, I use Enhanced Damage. This gives me a 15% boost in damage whilst rage is active. Pretty simple choice for this skill here. Hulk likes smashing stuff. The final mastery in this section I use is Controlled Rage, as I'm pretty spammy with my rage button. Reducing the initial cost helps me not to burn through the whole meter, but if you feel the other skills better fit your playstyle, definitely have a little play around here. Moving on to the final mastery tree now, Intrinsic Overcharge, and I've opted for Chance Boost in this column. This just helps me to hit crits and as a result, higher damage when overcharged. In the second column here, I use Damage Boost. This helps with my damage output when overcharged, which thanks to the skill selection earlier with Hulk's Assault Heroic, should have you in an almost permanent state of overcharge, which massively helps when fighting against multiple enemies for a long time. And for the final skill selection, I've gone with Temper, which slows overcharge energy drain to keep Hulk angrier for longer, which helps close the gap between overcharge and heroic regen too. Right, now we've gone over the skill choices, let's talk about champion skill focuses. I tend to focus on similar skills with all heroes with a little variance, but when the champion system first launched, we didn't really know what the best thing was to focus on. But one thing we noticed is that the whole combat boost section basically adds nothing to your character. So, with that in mind, here's my priority order for champion points. Quick note though, I wouldn't suggest going all the way to the 5th unlocks until you have spread your points across the other skills, as 16 champion points aren't that easy to come across outside of XP boost events. By the way, if you want to see the quickest way to level your champion points, don't forget to check out my fast XP leveling video. Links in the description down below. Right, let's get onto the list. Number 1, critical damage. This is going to give you a 5% boost on each unlock that increases crit damage, which this build heavily focuses on, so a major priority on this. Number 2, heroic recharge. With a 2.5% boost to recharge per unlock, this will help you to regain your heroics incredibly quickly in general, but with this build, it will help you to have almost infinite heroics. Number 3, critical chance. Crit damage is pointless without a chance to actually do a critical hit. Each step in this tree will give you a flat 1% boost to crit chance, which is actually really good. Number 4, perk chance. Basically, the more you unlock this tree, the more chance you have of proccing stuff like damage buff, payloads, and more, which help, well, pretty much every build. Number 4, stun and status damage. You'll gain an additional 2% on both of these damage types, which will help when dealing battery damage, but also stun, which really helps during certain raid phases. Number 5, fortification boost. As I focus on resilience a lot with this build to lower any incoming damage, this is my main defensive focus, as all unlocks will provide a flat 5% additional armor. After these, feel free to put your points wherever you like, but make sure to leave the combat ones until last, as they have the least utility across the board. Now, let's take a look at gear. One thing to bear in mind here is that most of the gear featured in this build is discordant gear, and the only places that you can grab that gear is in the raid, the elite raid, or the corrupted vibranium event. That said, you will be able to use the basis of the build to achieve some of the same effects even if you haven't done the raid or had access to that event yet. So, starting with melee, this piece is a great stat roll for this build. Probably one of the only times that I've been happy with a 2-stat roll. With Might and Valor rolling above 100 each, this is exactly what I need. The first perk, Lethal Vibranium Conduit, is perfect for this build too, as any enemies that I defeat that have a Vibranium status applied will trigger the Sonic Conduit buff that regens intrinsic and heroic energy. This not only helps my infinite heroic cycle, but also helps to keep Hulk's rage meter full, which also increases damage to enemies, heals Hulk when attacking, reduces damage received, and stagger. Another reason why perk 1 is so good is because of perk 2, and that's because of the light combo and power attacks applying Vibranium. Since power attacks are my key melee attack that also applies a hefty amount of status build-up, these two perks are perfect together. The third perk here is also super helpful. By extending the Bone Shaker buff by 8.5 seconds, I can keep my damage, defense, and heroic regen buffs up for longer. But the real value of this perk will become more apparent as we go through the rest of the build. Onto my range piece now. This is a regular discordant piece of gear, so you'll only be able to obtain it from the raid or the corrupted vibranium event. This piece has an amazing roll for Hulk, with might, valor, and resilience all rolling above 85. The vibranium double leak works fantastically to apply vibranium status to other enemies when hit with a vibranium attacks when a full stack of Sonic has been applied. But sadly, I don't actually apply Sonic in any part of this build, although you can 100% take advantage of this when other team members apply it to enemies. The second perk here allows me to also apply vibranium status and damage with range attacks, including attacks with small debris using the dodge maneuver as mentioned earlier in the video. The final perk here though is the gold mine. Since Hulk's range leaves a lot to be desired, many range perks are useless in his hands. But luckily this raid gear actually drops a melee perk in the range slot that allows you to proc damage buff on melee crits. This perk applies a buff that increases all damage by around 60%. So having this perk is not only OP, but also functions as a fourth melee perk for a hero that is almost entirely melee focused, which is just perfect. Onto my defensive piece now. This is also a discordant elite piece of gear, so you'll only be able to obtain it from the elite raid. This piece can definitely use some improvement in terms of perks. More or less, most of them are useless. The first is highly situational and depends on revives. The second isn't too bad as it gives you a chance to resist all damage from Sonic attacks. Fun fact, Claw's one-shot wob attacks count as Sonic attacks, so there's a chance that you could even survive one of those. And the third perk depends on you actually sending the Sonic Conduit, which this build doesn't do. That said, the stats roll here is spot on, so until I can find a piece that drops great perks with great stats, this is what I'm using. Onto the heroic slot now, and this is the first piece of gear so far that isn't raid gear. The World Breaker's Neuronics is an absolute titan of a gear piece. The first perk allows you to increase impact whilst raid is active by 25%. This can help to stagger enemies and stop them staggering you, which is huge for a melee character. The second increases rock damage by 25% too. This helps your generally weak ranged attacks, but also helps with small debris or large debris melee attacks too. But the third perk here is the real McCoy. Bone Shaker Supercharge holds this build together. The 3% increased willpower and heroic regen is actually more like 300%. And considering it works off of Bone Shaker, which you'll have noticed in this build is pretty much going to be up all of the time, this is the piece that finalizes the infinite heroic cycle. If you're looking to land this piece, just run your weekly Elite Vault mission or the last Avengers standing mission until you get that perfect roll. Onto artifacts now, and this is pretty straightforward. Like my Widow build, I've targeted this Valor ISO for a couple of reasons. Number one being the stat roll. Although not a perfect roll, I'm still waiting for the perfect triple 64, this yellow ISO 8 has fantastic stats. As well as this, I've managed to roll it with increased regen speed of my Assault Heroic and an even powerful Breaker, which increases the damage from power attacks by 11%, which is my main attack in this build when not using Heroics. I nabbed this from Sydney Gaffer Levine in the Shield Substation Zero. Just make sure to check his shop out every day and you should be able to grab something similar easily enough. Onto the second minor artifact now. I use this ISO 8 of Cosmic Affinity that rolled pretty nicely stat-wise. The first perk is a bit naff, but the second is Reactive Cosmic Surge. This is actually one of the best perks in the game, so much so that I did a video dedicated to it specifically. Go check that video out, link in the description below. But yeah, it's great, so definitely have one on hand if you need a little extra help with survivability. If you're looking for these, I recommend searching DNA chests and vault missions or the OLT. Finally now, onto the major artifact, and while most people will suggest going for either the Tactagon or the Nornstone of Lethal Will, I've gone for the Ring of Nibelung, which increases the amount of heroic energy gained from heroic orbs, and also gives you the ability to spawn your own orbs and help regen either your health, your intrinsic, or your heroics. Either way, it's incredibly useful to have when your build depends on keeping up your heroic meters, as it basically speeds up your heroic regen even more. Each of Hulk's heroics can make enemies drop orbs when they're defeated. Collect those orbs and you can basically instantly regen your heroics when Bone Shaker is up, which again is just fed more by using your assault and ultimate heroics, creating a truly incredible Hulk.
One of their agents is down.
So good of you to come. A shame you won't be around long.
Glad we're on the same page about your chances.
Fight! Smash!
So, to summarise, in this build we have infinite heroic cycle, insane orb generation, near invincibility from rage, huge damage output, and even self-healing. Also, if you're looking for the best way to build your Iron Man or to level up your champion levels super fast, check out these videos on the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you all soon. Bye bye.